Good afternoon. My name is Yuxiang Chou, a current master's student at Tufts University, and I will be serving as your moderator today. Today in our workshop light session, how to use NHANES for diet sustainability analysis, we will have Dr. Zach Conrad as our speaker. Dr. Conrad is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Sciences and a faculty affiliate at the Global Research Institute at William and Mary Williamsburg, Virginia. He's a nutritional epidemiologist and food systems scientist, and his research leverages large datasets and modeling techniques to examine the complex interactions between food choice, diet quality, environmental sustainability, and affordability. He's the author of more than 45 peer-reviewed scientific publications, and he sits on the editorial board for the Journal of Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and Nutrition Journal. His research is currently supported by the grants from Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Science, the Commonwealth Center for Energy and the Environment, and the Jeffers Trust. Before joining William and Mary, Dr. Conrad was a postdoctoral scientist at USDA from 2016 to 2019, and postdoctoral scholar at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University from 2015 to 2016. He earned his PhD in nutrition from Friedman School, his MS in food systems from the Friedman School, his MPH in nutrition from Tufts University's School of Medicine, and his BA in biology and anthropology from Trent University in Ontario, Canada. Now, please welcome Dr. Conrad to lead this workshop session.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that very generous introduction. So it's just fantastic to be back here with you all, although we're obviously not in person. I hope to in the coming year, actually, especially as we gear up for the ASN conference in the summer. But for now, I think this will do quite well. And it's just nice to be kind of back in the Friedman mix after a few years away and after so long that I was at the Friedman School. So thank you all for tuning in today. This workshop is going to be a little different than the way that I deliver most of my presentations. This is going to be a quicker flow through the slides. So I'm not going to linger too much on any one slide. And the whole idea here is to give an overview and to provide a resource for you all in case you wanted to revisit it, to tap into it again, to conduct any NHANES diet sustainability analyses. So there's just so much that we're going to cover. This could be an entire course, and really distilling this into 30, 40 minutes means that we kind of need to go pretty rapidly. So I'm also providing throughout this workshop resources that come from my lab and from other labs and peer-reviewed publications that have links to a lot of the data sets that we're going to be talking about. So I'm just going to set the stage and not spend too long, but just set the stage on what the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey is, how it collects data, how it came to be. I'm then going to touch on each of these areas of sustainability, nutrition and health outcomes. I'm going to talk about how you link those to environmental outcomes, how you link that all to diet cost. And then we're going to talk about how you factor in loss and waste. And that is going to be really important as we need to adjust all of our estimates for the amount of food that is not just that we consume, but also that's inedible and that's wasted by the consumer. And then in some cases, which we'll talk about, it's important to factor in how much is lost at the retail level. So just bear with me on the loss and waste, and it'll all become clear how this all maps together. So the NHANES was not always NHANES. It was actually originally the National Health Examination Survey. And this really all came to be in the National Health Survey Act of 1956. And so this gave authority to HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, to collect information from Americans about what they're doing, lifestyle behaviors, what their exposures to certain environmental contaminants are, and how that then relates to their health status. And so this information is collected in a number of different ways, including interviews, physical examinations, and laboratory tests. But as you're going to see, this is really expanded as we get into the modern era of the current NHANES. So from 1960 to 1970, we were collecting data from about 7,500 people during those time periods, right? From 1960 to 1962, 7,500, and then each of those incremental 2 to 4 year periods. And it wasn't until 1970 that the NHANES really took shape. This was really the addition of a more rigorous way to collect nutrition data, right? Dietary data from people. So as you can see, starting in 1971, that 71 to 75 timeframe, the sample size really ballooned, right? We were collecting data previously from about 7,500 people. Now, during that 4-year period of 71 to 75, 28,000 people. And so we continued on down this path until 1994. But actually, as you'll see, in 1990, this was when a major shift happened in NHANES. So the National Nutrition Monitoring and Related Research Act of 1990 gave authority to not just Department of Health and Human Services, but also to Department of Agriculture to carry out the entire NHANES project. And importantly, what it did is it did two important things. One is that it made data collection continuous. So it wasn't collected anymore in these kind of 2-year chunks or 4-year chunks. It means that data are collected all throughout the year, right, from participants. So that's one big thing. And then the other big thing is that it made this data available to public users, right? So it wasn't just in a hard to access government platform anymore. So 1999 was the first year that continuous NHANES took shape. And it was 4 more years until we made a few more big changes. One, we included an additional dietary recall. So now there are 2 dietary recalls that are collected from most participants. So 80% of participants have 2 dietary recalls. And then we also implemented the automated multiple pass method. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is a computer-assisted method that helps to reduce the respondent burden and also to increase the precision and reliability of the data that we're collecting. But again, I'll mention this again in a few minutes. So NHANES uses this 4-stage stratified sampling design. And you will have heard about this type of sampling design before, often known as complex survey design or hierarchical sampling design. And the way that this works is that a computer program identifies about 15 countries across the US that have a certain degree of heterogeneity in their demographic characteristics, lifestyle behaviors that we're collecting from other data sources, including the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. And then what it does is within those 15 counties, it then identifies census blocks. And then within those census blocks, identifies households. And then within those households, identifies individuals to participate in NHANES. And those are those 4 stages when we talk about a 4-stage sampling design. And that's not just important conceptually for NHANES and how it works, but it's also important analytically, because what this means is that each person has a different probability of being selected into participation into NHANES. So you need to be able to account for this in your analytic code. And this is done with 2 variables, the primary sampling unit variable, which is SDMVPSU, and also the strata variable, which is SDMVSTRA. So these are variables, standard variables that you'll find in NHANES, and a good place to look for them is the demographic data file. So the way that it works now, really since 1999, is not just that we're collecting data continuously throughout the year, but we're specifically collecting data from about 5,000 people each year, and approximately half are under age 20. So the way that this works is that since we're not obviously able to collect data from every person in the country, but we still want to make this nationally representative, we assign a survey weight or a sample weight to each person that represents their demographic proportionality throughout the rest of the United States population. So if there are, say, approximately 5 to 6% of our population is Asian American, we don't need to make sure that the NHANES population is 5 to 6% Asian American, right? Because we can apply this sampling weight to each person to basically blow up their estimate so that it represents what it might look like at the population level. And it's this combination of this multi-stage survey design and these sampling weights, which I just mentioned, which makes NHANES nationally representative. Now, just like we talked about how the multi-stage survey design needs to be incorporated into your analytic code, we talked about the SDMV PSA and SDMV STRA variables. The sample weights also need to be included, and you specify this with the variable WTD RD1 for if you're just using 1 day of recall. And if you're using 2 days of recall, it's just WTD RD2. And again, these are standard variables that you can find in NHANES. Now, there's a little bit of complexity if you're going to combine multiple waves of NHANES, multiple cycles. So these data, although they're collected continuously across the year, they are released to the public in these 2-year cycles. So you'll see a cycle like in 2001 to 2002 cycle, 2003 to 2004 cycle, and so on. So that's how that we report those NHANES data to the public or release them to the public. So what you need to do if you're going to be merging multiple years or waves of NHANES, you just need to divide that weight variable, the WTD RD1, by the number of waves that you're merging together. There's an additional complexity if you're using specifically the data from 1999 to 2002, but it's an easy formula, and that's something that you can get from the NHANES analytic guidelines that are published online on the NHANES site. So the data are collected using these mobile examination centers, and these are what are traveling from county to county to census block to households to individuals. And this is basically this combination of medical clinics and scientific laboratories. And we use these interviews or questionnaires to collect information, anthropometric measurements, physical exams, and also laboratory tests. And I've just given a few examples here of just the types of information that are collected using each of these different protocols. So we use a 24-hour recall, which I think most, if not everybody, is familiar with, an open-ended survey about foods that were consumed over the previous 24 hours. And then this automated multiple pass method. Again, this was implemented in 2003, and this is a computer program that makes it easier for respondents to provide information on their dietary behaviors. It also reduces the amount of bias that would result from just asking people just the question, what did you consume, right? So it's the multiple passes are each of these 5 different types of questions that are asked. So you first list all the foods that you've consumed over the previous 24-hour period. Then you go through all of those foods again, and there's specific probes about specific food groups. You get asked again about each of those foods, the eating time, eating occasion, and the amounts that are consumed for each of these foods. And then there's a specific series of probes that ask about commonly forgotten places where people might eat food, like in their car, as they're heading out of the house, during meetings, while they're shopping, and things like that. And then this is all done in person, but then there's a follow-up for 80% of the participants who then complete another recall using the automated multiple pass method about 3 to 10 days later by telephone. So what NHANES is providing is information on mixed dishes, because that's what people consume. Yes, it's true that we are consuming, say, like an orange. So if I was to consume an orange and I was asked to participate in NHANES, I would say that I consumed an orange yesterday, but that is really a fraction of really it's the types of foods that people typically are consuming, right? The example that we're going to run with today is a cheeseburger. So a cheeseburger you would consider a mixed dish because it includes multiple different foods within that dish. So this is the question, right? How do you get from mixed dishes, information on mixed dishes and NHANES, to all of these other sustainability impacts? One, the health impacts, and we can look at that cross-sectionally or prospectively, nutrients, diet costs, environmental impacts like greenhouse gas emissions and cumulative energy demand, and agricultural resource use. So like agricultural land, pesticides, fertilizers, irrigation water. And then of course, like I promised, we're going to talk about loss and waste, because that is all going to factor in prominently to all of this. So bear with me. Again, this is supposed to be a resource that you can come back to access. So I'm going to keep progressing through this pretty quickly for you. So in order to be able to link mixed dishes to all of these other sustainability impacts, we then need to break these mixed dishes down into foods and then break down those foods into ingredients. So like a mixed dish would be a cheeseburger, a food in that mixed dish would be the bun, and then an ingredient in that bun would be the wheat, right? And we'll take a look at this. So this is the general flow of information and data sources that you need to integrate in order to be able to incorporate all of these different sustainability domains. So it's a heavy lift, but once you can establish these linkages conceptually and then in your analytical code, then it's a lot easier to work with. So it's also, I'm hoping, a lot easier to work with now that I'm presenting it to you all here. But I've also written a paper on this, which you'll see in the bottom left-hand side of your screen, that is also designed to be a resource. So this talk is really drafted from this particular paper that I would encourage you to return to if you're interested in running any of these analyses. So once we have participants, you can see my cursor. You have participants from NHANES. It's pretty easy to then get the health status and health outcomes. You don't need to break down the foods, right? Because the health outcomes and the health status is associated with the individual, right? You do some analytical work to be able to understand how that's associated with the foods they consumed. But in terms of the data linkage, you're linking it to a person. So that's pretty straightforward, although we will talk about it briefly. Then the rest of this really starts with mixed dishes that you can then break down into individual foods. And in these boxes, in the parentheses, these are the data sources. Break it down into foods. And then once you've broken down those mixed dishes into foods, you can estimate food prices, which translates into diet costs, nutrient intake of food groups. And then once you have food group intake, then you can estimate agricultural resources using, for example, the food print model, but there's other ways to do this as well. And then if you take those mixed dishes and you break them down into ingredients, you can then use that data to estimate greenhouse gas emissions and cumulative energy demand with data field, which again, we'll talk about, and also estimate loss and waste. So when we're talking about health status, we would think of that as cross-sectional, right? So NHANES is providing pretty comprehensive information on a lot of different indicators of health status. So if somebody reported, well, actually even better, if somebody gave information they had, for example, a blood draw, right? And that blood draw indicated dyslipidemia. So high levels of circulating triglycerides, for example, then you can link that data to the person. And so you can start to identify, well, who in the population has dyslipidemia. But that doesn't tell you about whether they develop dyslipidemia later, so after they consume particular foods, or whether it was at the same time, or whether they actually adopted a certain diet because they had dyslipidemia to begin with. So the causal effect, you just don't know. But what is not apparent to a lot of people is that NHANES also provides a linkage to prospective data on mortality. So this is done through the National Center for Health Statistics, which is providing this link between NHANES respondents and the National Death Index. So the National Death Index is an index of all people who have died in the United States since the 1970s. So they then link the US government, mostly through the National Center for Health Statistics, is linking people from NHANES to the National Death Index through probabilistic matching, because they have data behind the scenes that we as the public are not privy to on identifying data for each of these people. So like social security number, in some cases their names, but is providing just the major causes of death. And so this is public, right? You can all access this, and it's designed to be linked to not just NHANES, but also to the National Health Interview Survey and a few other national surveys that the National Center for Health Statistics manages. So to move forward to all of these other sustainability outcomes, we first, remember, need to break down these mixed dishes into individual foods. So again, we're going to run with this cheeseburger example because it's a good one. So NHANES is providing mixed dishes. We basically have a list of mixed dishes in NHANES of about 4,500 of these mixed dishes. And then we can break down these mixed dishes like a cheeseburger into the individual foods: bun, cheese, burger, lettuce, tomato, pickle sauce, whatever else is on your Big Mac or whatever kind of cheeseburger you're eating. And the way that we do this is with the food and nutrient database for dietary studies. So this is a food composition database that's providing the amount and weight of every food in every NHANES mixed dish. So FNDDS is actually, it includes many more you could call it like recipes, right? It includes many more foods than are actually in NHANES. So it includes about 8,000 foods. And then a fraction of those, so 3,000 of those foods, are then aggregated into these various combinations to represent each of the 4,500 NHANES mixed dishes, okay? So FNDDS is going one step further and also providing nutrient data for each of the foods. And since it's providing nutrient data for each of the foods, then you can just add up the nutrients, right? The calcium from each of the foods and each mixed dish to get the amount of nutrients in each mixed dish. So then the question is, well, where do these nutrient data come from? So these come from Food Data Central. This is a new rebranded food nutrient composition database that was formerly the nutrient database for standard reference, but just since 2009, it's really been rebranded as Food Data Central. So the way that this works is that through contracted analyses, through contributions from the food industry, collections from scientific literature, the USDA is then compiling all of this information on the nutrient content of foods, and then are aggregating these nutrient contents into mixed dishes so that then we can estimate what is the nutrient content of the mixed dishes in NHANES. So in some cases, they're sending technicians all across the country to actually collect samples to ship them to specific USDA-approved research laboratories. They're running them through mass specs and other ways of collecting nutrient data from foods, of extracting that nutrient data. And then this is all getting uploaded into the Food Data Central. And fortunately, you don't have to even worry about Food Data Central because this has been linked to NHANES through FNDDS. So as long as you have NHANES and FNDDS, then that linkage has already been done for you. And actually, the good folks at NHANES have even gone one step further. If you're just interested in the nutrient content of NHANES mixed dishes, there's actually an NHANES data file for that. So you don't even have to leave the NHANES site to collect this nutrient information. If you wanted to get into the nutrient information, nutrient content of specific foods, then you have to dip into FNDDS. But otherwise, you're safe to stay within the NHANES site. But I think it's important for you to know what's happening behind the scenes. All right, so now we have the participants from NHANES. We have information on their health status, health outcomes. We can get information on the mixed dishes that they're consuming, on the foods that they're consuming through FNDDS, and then we know how that connects to nutrient data on those foods through Food Data Central. So now we're part of the way there, and now we just need to cross the barrier into estimating food groups. And we do this with the Food Patterns Ingredients database. So don't let the word ingredients in the title here throw you off. It really is focused on foods. So the way that this works is that this converts the amount of mixed dish consumed into servings of individual food groups. So what it's doing is it's taking that cheeseburger from NHANES and it's saying, well, that cheeseburger contains one serving of grains. It would be refined grains, typically. It contains 3 servings of protein, 1.5 servings of dairy, so on and so forth, right? So you're able to extract the individual foods from using FNDDS, but then if you apply FPID, the food patterns ingredients database to FNDDS, that will tell you that bun that's in that cheeseburger represents 1 serving, let's say, of refined grains. So this is the way that we can start to extract information on not just the gram weight of that bun in that cheeseburger, which is going to be provided by FNDDS, but also FPID can come in and convert that gram weight of that bun into the number of servings, which is really relevant for dietary analysis. So this is where we are now. And our next step is then to aggregate this into food groups for the mixed dishes, right? So you can estimate the amount of grains in a bun, but what the food patterns equivalence database does is it then sums all of those foods in a given mixed dish. So now you have the amount of servings of grains in a cheeseburger. So just a step back, FPID is going to tell you how many servings of grain is in that bun. And then FPED, the food patterns equivalence database, is going to tell you how many servings of grain are in that whole cheeseburger. So fortunately, you don't have to go through the work of accessing FPID and then summing all of those servings for each of those foods in each mixed dish, because that's already been done for you in the food patterns equivalence database. But both are available to you. So if you want to work at the food level, then you can do that through FPID. If you want to work at the mixed dish level, then you can do that through the FPED. So now that we have the amount of food groups that are being consumed by each individual in NHANES, now we can start to estimate agricultural resources. And the way that we in my lab do that is with the food print model. This was developed by Chris Peters, who was at the Friedman School actually until just a couple years ago. Now he's at USDA. And I worked closely with him at the time, and I continue to work with him now. And I've taken that model and then I've refashioned it so it does some other cool stuff too. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how food print works, but I'll just provide a summary for you. So if you start here, if you can see my cursor, you can enter the dietary data variables. So enter information from FPID or FPED, right? Depending on whether you want to work at the food level or the mixed dish level. You enter that information into on the consumption of individual food groups, enter that into food print. And then these embedded calculations are going to work backwards in the food system. So they're going to say, okay, well, you entered this amount of, say, refined grain intake. Well, it's going to estimate, well, what are the losses and waste? What are the food processing conversions? What are the livestock feed requirements that go into, well, that's actually going to be more relevant to like an animal source food, but we can stick with our cheeseburger, right? So say you're going to estimate the agricultural resources associated with that beef patty. What are the livestock feed requirements that go into that? Crop and grazing yields. This is an adjustment for crops that have multiple end uses. For example, soybeans can be pressed into meal and also be used for oil, but it also accounts for this multi-use crop adjustment. So some crops are grown on the same parcel of land in different times of the year. And then it brings in data on how much land is available for farming. The amendments, so that's just agricultural inputs like chemicals and irrigation water. And then it will give you information on how many people can be supported by this diet. What is the amount of agricultural land that's required? What is the amount of chemicals like pesticides and fertilizers? And also what's the amount of irrigation water that's needed to supply this diet? And then we've done a number of things like incorporate a trade component to handle whether you want to model a local food system or a globalized food system. And also there's an embedded macro that will allow you to integrate NHANES data. So the model runs through iteratively every person in your NHANES sample and then provides you with a summary estimate. So this is just documented in a series of publications from my lab and also from other labs as well, which I'm just including on the slide in case you want to come back to for further reference. We're getting prepared to release Foodprint 2.0. This has a number of additional features, this trade toggle switch, which again is going to allow users to either model an open or a closed food system. So an open food system allows for trade, a closed one models a local food system. We're including farmed seafood, which wasn't included in the previous model. So what are the land requirements and agricultural resource requirements for that? The macro, which I've just talked about, which allows you to integrate NHANES data. Also, the original Foodprint model didn't allow you to estimate the agricultural chemicals and irrigation water. It now does. We did large-scale updating of all of the data, the input data. And then we're also creating and this hasn't been released quite yet, so this is kind of a sneak peek behind the scenes, that we are creating a computer software so that researchers in multiple capacities can be able to access this, but also it's also designed for public use as well. This I'm not going to go into in any amount of detail, but it basically just shows the connections, the linkages that need to be made from FPED all the way to Foodprint. In other words, whether you can get the data directly from FPED or whether they need to be converted through FNDDS first in order to get the input variables for Foodprint. So if you're wondering, for example, how do you take the grain data on grain intake from FPED and insert it into Foodprint? Well, that's just a direct entry. But if you wanted to, say, estimate the amount of pork, well, you just need to run that through. You need to flag the foods that have pork in them in NHANES, run it through FPED, and then apply that to NHANES, and that will give you the amount that you need to enter into Foodprint. So this is all documented in some of the publications that I have referenced already. And also as in Foodprint 2.0, we're releasing the code, the STATA code that's needed to do all these conversions. So it should be designed that you can just basically press enter and gives you the information that you need. Okay, so this is where we are. We're moving pretty far along. Now we're all the way up to agricultural resources. And now we can start to estimate food prices. So the best way to do this now is with the purchase to plate price tool. So this is provided by the Economic Research Service as part of USDA. And this is providing national average retail prices for each NHANES food and each NHANES mixed dish. So this amazingly represents 50% of all retail foods in the US. And this has been recorded by checkout scanners throughout the US, so at the point of purchase. So a few limitations. This only links to NHANES 2013 and 2016, which is what I would have been saying yesterday had I given this presentation. But actually, yesterday is very exciting that the PPPT has now been officially released to the public, and it has been released from 2011 to 2018. So there's still limitation that NHANES goes back to 1999, but we only have price data for foods from 2011 to 2018. But still, that limitation has been somewhat reduced. A real limitation, continuing limitation, is that it only provides prices for foods at home. So even though NHANES participants would have indicated that they purchase foods away from home, it's still going to apply a food at home price. And that doesn't always work because most foods that we purchase away from home are more expensive than if we were to prepare them at home. It only provides prices for the consumed portion of food. So this is critical because when you go to buy food at the grocery store, you're buying the portion that you're eventually going to waste. And you're buying the portion that's inedible. And both of those have prices attached to it, right? So if you were to just estimate the consumed portion, it would lead to underestimates. And again, this last limitation that it's not publicly available, as of yesterday, it is publicly available. So these are some ways that my team has developed to address each of these problem areas, these limitations. I'm not going to go through them in any amount of detail now, just in the interest of time. But again, the whole point of this talk is to provide a general workshop that you can and a resource that you can come back to when you have questions about how do I actually link up these data? What do I do when I want to factor in the price of food away from home? What do I do when I want to incorporate data from prior NHANES years? What do I do when I want to incorporate the price that's associated or the cost that's associated with food loss, for example? So I won't go through these in any more than that, but I just wanted to provide them to you on the screen so that you could access them later if you wanted to. And these are just some publications which we've described these methods. So just some additional resources for you to look into. Okay, so now we have health status, health outcomes. We're able to estimate food prices, nutrient intake, intake of food groups. We can estimate agricultural resource use. And now what's left is we need to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions and cumulative energy demand. So in order to do that, we need to break down these mixed dishes into ingredients, right? So we have mixed dishes, foods, and then ingredients. So the way that we do this is with the food commodity intake database. And this is converting NHANES mixed dishes into individual ingredients. So just like you would have a bun here, what FCID is doing is it's saying, well, that bun has all of these different ingredients, right? For example, wheat, it might have a corn-based sweetener, it would have oil, and that beef patty would have sometimes a glutinous mixture to combine it. It would have obviously the beef, it would have additional beef meat and beef fat to meet certain palatability characteristics of certain markets, and a number of other smaller ingredients. Now, if you were to have something like lettuce, right? There's no additional ingredients in lettuce. Lettuce is lettuce. So it's not doing any further conversion there. But for a lot of these foods, there is additional conversions because there's multiple ingredients in many of these individual foods. So FCID is incredibly useful. Big problem is that it only links with NHANES 2001 to 2010. So we have so much appreciate that this is such a severe limitation that we've gone through a fair amount of work to update this to 2018. So now FCID does link from 2001 to 2018 NHANES, and this is the publication that we describe those methods, and also that we provide the data as a publicly available data set through this publication. So there's a hyperlink, and you can access it through this publication. So now that we have information on the consumption of individual ingredients, now we can link this up to data field, which is the database of food impacts on the environment for linking to diets. And this was done through a series of systematic reviews that estimated the amount of greenhouse gas emissions and cumulative energy that is associated with each of these ingredients. So now that we know the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with, let's just say, wheat flour, and we know how much wheat flour is in a bun, and we know how much of that bun is in a mixed dish like a cheeseburger, you can see that now we can just start to add these things up, and then we can arrive at what is the greenhouse gas emissions for a cheeseburger. Now, the only thing that's left to do is to estimate loss and waste. So we do this through the loss adjusted food availability data system, which was created by the Economic Research Service at USDA. And this is providing data on the amount of each individual, I think it's helpful to call them ingredients, but they will often refer to them as commodities, for each of the ingredients in this database. So there's approximately 200 of them. And this then can be linked to FCID that we just talked about. And there's a few groups that have done this linkage, right? Because this hasn't been done by the government agencies that support these databases. So these need to be done by individual researchers. My lab has done this, and we've reported in some of the publications that I've presented to you already, we've reported on the ways that we do that. So you can just, and these are downloadable as supplementary files in these publications, so you can access them directly, but we don't have exclusive ownership over this method. So there are other groups that have done this as well. But I would encourage you to access our linkage files because they're just easily downloadable. So why is that important to be estimating loss and waste? Well, again, we talked about it is important if you want to estimate diet cost, right? Because the food that you're purchasing from the grocery store or from a restaurant, that's not just the food that you're going to consume. You're also paying for the amount that you will eventually waste and the amount that is inedible, right? So if you were to buy a mango, for example, you're not going to eat that pith, right? So, but you're paying for that weight of it anyway. So we need to be able to factor in this loss and waste. So if you're just going to estimate health outcomes, well, health outcomes aren't associated with the loss portion, right? Those health outcomes are associated with the amount that you consumed. So you don't need the loss and waste variables. But if you're going to estimate diet cost, you certainly do. And if you want to estimate the environmental impacts, you'll also may need, I would argue that you do need to bring in not just the inedible portion, the portion that was wasted by the consumer, but also the amount that was lost at the retail stage, right? So there's environmental impacts that are associated with food loss and waste, as well as the amount that's consumed. So if you're going to be bringing in into a single analysis data on health status, diet cost, and environmental outcomes, well, I would argue that you're going to need to just make sure that you are incorporating certain types of loss and waste at multiple different stages. So this is a framework for when to do that and how to do it. So we got through a lot, and that was the whole point. I'm glad that we finished with a little bit of time to spare so that I can answer any questions that you might have. And again, I want to stress that if you're thinking that, well, we really breezed through a lot of this complex information really quickly, that was intentional, right? That was the only way that I could present you with all of the information that you needed so that you could run these analyses yourself. And the whole idea is that this will be a resource that you can access yourself to conduct your own analyses. So thank you again for your time. And it would be my pleasure to answer any questions that you might have.